CAD Foundation in Istanbul, Turkey, talking to Associate Professor of Architecture in the Architecture Department at the Weizmann School of Design, University of Pennsylvania, Ferda Kolatan. And Ferda has been pursuing a number of architecture studios in terms of architecture education at the Weizmann School for about 4 or 5 years now here in Turkey. We're going to talk a little bit about the Weizmann School, what he's been doing there in his classes on architecture at the master's level, and then speak a little bit about our present activities in Antalya with regard to archaeology and architecture. So Ferda, you've been teaching at Weizmann for how many years now?
Since 2004.
And these travel studios are a bit different, right? So how do they fit in to the architecture education at the Weizmann?
So in the MArch program at Weizmann, it's basically a 3-year program, 6 semesters. We consider the first 4 semesters core, and then the final 2 semesters advanced design research in the studios. And during those final 2 studios, we take the students to different locations, international, sometimes domestic as well. And the goal of these studios is to engage with a different culture, different place, understand the circumstances of that place, its specificities and unique conditions regarding an architectural either problem or an architectural history, or perhaps an environmental condition that is unique and important for us to study as architects. So we like to take them to that place directly, to the site, organize meetings and interviews with other experts and practices, museums, and so forth. So the students get a relatively complete picture, as complete as it can get during the 1-week travel, and then we will go back and redevelop the projects based on that research.
And you've traveled to both different locations in the United States and globally. What are the places you visited before? You had places that you had architecture studios before you arrived in Turkey?
I started to teach in the advanced studios in 2016. And the first 3 studios I taught in Cairo, Egypt. After that, since 2018, we started to collaborate with you, and we started to come to Turkey. And then in between, we had COVID, and we weren't really allowed or couldn't travel internationally. So I have 3 studios during that time that I taught in New York and 1 in Las Vegas.
So these studios here in Turkey, since 2018, we visited and engaged with particular sites here in Istanbul, Cappadocia. We had one in the Izmir region, in Ephesus. Can you describe how it's kind of progressed, both your thinking about working in the cultural context here, because you have a Turkish background yourself. What happened? I mean, has your idea of what goes on here and the way that you've been able to teach in these studios changed since the first studios in Istanbul?
Yeah, absolutely. It changed quite a bit. Well, the way how it started, I mean, my interest in taking students to Turkey, as you pointed out, Istanbul, Cappadocia, the Aegean, and now Pamphylia, is the incredibly rich historic archaeological architecture in this region. From early Anatolian architecture to Greco-Roman, Byzantine, Seljuk, Ottoman, all the way to modern Republican architecture. It's just such a wealth of different influences. And one thing that interests me personally as a designer is to integrate architecture that already exists and has a long history into contemporary design. Because I think we are doing too little of that. Usually there are 2 ways of dealing with quote-unquote ancient architecture. One is to preserve it if we deem it to be valuable. It becomes a heritage site, some kind of a monument that you don't touch and becomes like a museum. The other way of dealing with it is if we don't deem it to be of value, we just let it decay and it goes away. And then at some point we build something new. given the overall environmental situation, I think architecture really has a responsibility to look for new ways of integrating the old instead of consistently taking things down and rebuilding them. So there's that aspect of sustainability I'm interested in. And then the second aspect, and they go hand in hand, is there is an incredible treasure of different cultural influences over time. And instead of looking at them as a museum condition or an archive condition, how can we learn and integrate them in more productive and proactive ways into new architecture? So when we come to Turkey and we look at these sites, our interest is not to just preserve them, but our interest is to take them and find ways of updating them toward contemporary needs and desires. So that has been a constant throughout these years, but it has changed with every one of these studios. We refined our techniques, we widened or broadened our understanding of the situation, and every step along the way we are trying to integrate what we learn toward the next studio.
Over the last few studios, starting a little bit in Cappadocia, then Efes, and here we've sort of engaged the discipline of archaeology. The discipline of archaeology had been central to architectural thinking and thought since the Renaissance up until, let's say, the 1960s or 70s. And today it doesn't really have much of a place in architectural education. Can you speak a little bit about how archaeology, your exposure to, the students' exposure to archaeology, its processes, its intellectual background, what is valuable there in terms of architectural thought and architectural design today?
Yeah, that's a really important question. My own interest, my field is obviously architecture, so I'm not an archaeologist. Always been interested in it, but I'm foremost a designer and interested in architecture. But if you look at ancient buildings or buildings that, I don't know, were built, let's say 200, 500, 1,000 years before our time, and then if you keep going back, your interest in archaeology rises, because there's no way of understanding that architecture without having some basic understanding of what archaeology is. One example I think that's really, to me, very interesting is archaeology, just like any other history, so to speak, is written by the victors, right? So, and for the longest period in time, the victors, in terms of a kind of historical understanding of the past, comes through a Greco-Roman, European, and then American lineage. And it's a beautiful lineage.
Which the University of Pennsylvania is
very much part of.
Essentially,
yes, yes. And it's beautiful, it's important, it's valuable, all of it. But it's one particular lens. And I think what I'm understanding more and more, particularly with our travels in Turkey, is that there are other ways of reading archaeology. Anatolian architecture, right? Hittite, Luvian. These are much less researched cultures. One reason, of course, is there's less of it excavated. But the other interest is because it didn't necessarily enforce that existing trajectory of how architecture developed, right? Which really, like I said, goes from the Greco-Roman via European classicism, modernism. So my interest really is to find, not swing around, but to understand that there always have been hybrids. And the most interesting architectural examples to me are those that mix and mesh and become hybridized, because that's my real belief that people always have acted that way. You know, so there's a cultural mixing, which of course turns into an architectural, stylistic mixing. And instead of trying to purify those and say, well, this is one and that's the other, I think to focus on how these moments of, let's say, architectural collaboration happen over time, to me is important. And there's no real name for it. There's no style which we can tag onto it. And I think there's a lot of work to be done.
In terms of the work to be done, the site for this present studio is a very interesting site. It's in Side, to the east of Antalya, in an area called Manamga. And Side is a very old port city, and the site that you picked out is the major Roman bathhouse. Can you describe a little bit about what we were just arrived from Side yesterday, what your first impressions of the place were? Initially, you understood, I guess, through plans and photographs, but when you got there and saw the place, what did you sort of learn from the archaeological excavations? And we did speak to the head of excavations, Ferda Kolatan. Can you describe that interaction with the actual place and archaeological processes you saw?
I mean, it's interesting. Side is very interesting, and my appreciation for Side has risen significantly during this trip. I always liked it. I've been there many times before, as recent as last December, but I wasn't quite able to see the specific layering of the city. I mean, one thing that immediately stands out to me, and that's why we chose the project to be located in Side, is Side, unlike, let's say, Perga or Aspendos or Termessos or one of those other sites, isn't a pure archaeological venue. But it's a place where people live today. It's in fact a very touristy place with a high level of tourism coming in at least 6-8 months out of the year. So there is the new and the old, or the ancient and the new, already mixing in Side. So you walk down the road and you can have your doner kebab, and you can buy souvenirs, and then on the corner you suddenly are exposed to 2,000-year-old artifacts sticking out of the ground. So for some people that's a problem, because they like to purify those regions and make sure nobody interferes with them. But I find these strange hybridizations really interesting. So that was the reason why we wanted to do this project in Side, and we picked an ancient bathhouse, which is the Grand Bathhouse. It's one of 4 or 5 in Side. And we want to basically create a new type of bathhouse that works on the foundations and with the ruins of the old one. So we're taking the idea of hybridization directly to the bathhouse. Now, what I learned in our conversations, also with Professor Alanyala, who was really explaining us the long history of Side, from, again, the Greek beginnings that go literally back millennia to the Roman time, which along the Pamphylian coast, most of what we see today is Roman. Right? There are bits and pieces that are still from the Greek or Hellenic times, but mostly it's Roman. And then Seljuk influences and then Ottoman influences. To be able to distinguish them, and again, that's the archaeological ability, right? Through certain techniques, geometries, layouts, and plan, I find really fascinating, because it's almost a mission to add to that. So why are we artificially saying time has ended, and from our point of view looking back as history, and we do something new, instead of what people have done for millennia? They just basically work on what's there and keep improving it. So I want to keep doing that, or at least I want to develop projects that propose ways of doing it without falling into the category of just being preservationists.
Right.
So what comes out of what we do is always cutting edge contemporary design, but it is not following, let's say, the notion of abstraction that in modernists is very important, right? You start with a tabula rasa. We never start with a tabula rasa.
Quite the opposite. Lots of nooks and crannies in Side. In terms of those nooks and crannies, the particular site, the hammam, what impressed me most was its materiality. There was these different stone architecture, construction systems, arches, and then there was a bunch of these very monolithic local sea stone, which I always forget the name of it.
Composite?
Whatever that name is. And then there were also a lot of layers of marbles and things like this. What do you feel is the importance of both materiality and architectonic in in the studio? Like, what do you hope to take that in any particular direction?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that also ties it back to the question of environment. Again, environmentalism and sustainable architecture is obviously a very big topic, and I think rightly so. We need to take responsibility how we build. But usually how the conversation about sustainable architecture unfolds, to me, is lacking a design and a kind of cultural component. It's usually way too heavily invested in material and construction techniques and solar energy and those kinds of questions. How to bring, all of that into some kind of control. My interest is much more to make sure that aspects of sustainability, which in the old days were just a given, because you wouldn't bring marble from 2,000 miles away. I mean, that just didn't make any sense. I mean, they happened here and there for palaces, etc., but usually you would source locally. So whatever the local material is, that's the material you would be using. And if the material is soft, you carve a different kind of ornament. If the material is hard, it becomes more difficult with ornamentation. So you usually begin to see different types of tectonic expressions. So the aesthetic is tied to the material that you're using. The performance is tied as well. Obviously, a stone is porous, lighter, it has a different kind of thermal set of properties than very hard granite or marble, etc. So it's very important to me to understand those kinds of relationships, and then again see with new technologies, just fabrication, robotics, etc. We have really very different kinds of tools that can express the material in novel ways. So it's still the same material, but we can, I think, tease out a different kind of expression from those materials because we have new kinds of tools that the ancients didn't have. So that's another interest I have.
Going back to this, your ideas on hybridity, we visited a site, a kind of citadel-type castle called Sidion, which is built on a kind of big limestone plateau in the Pamphylian plain, and it's the highest point in the Pamphylian plain. And we had never visited, and we were both very impressed by the place. There was a very interesting hybrid condition in which the Ottomans built Ottoman hammam inside a Roman bath, and it's in terms of your ideas of hybridity, it seems like, and this is what all Silion was about, was taking whatever was there and kind of working with it and kind of creating hybrids with the past, both expressively, programmatically, but also, I think, interestingly enough, as a kind of experience. So could you describe your impressions of Silion and these kind of very hybrid with the Hellenic, the Byzantine, the Roman, Seljuk, because I think it was a very, very interesting place that everybody should go visit.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think you already laid out the basic concepts why Silion is that interesting. If we look at Side again, we described it earlier as something where you also have the new and the old reside together. But if you study the history of Side, you know that at some point it was depopulated almost entirely. After Arab pirate conquest, Side could no longer retain itself, and it basically died out for hundreds of years, and then it was repopulated really recently in the 20th century. So there's a big sort of gap in between, and you can see that gap with new and the old being very new and quite old, right? Silion is apparently not like that. Apparently, we've seen it. It's not like that in the sense that it was consistently populated, even though you don't see much modern buildings there. Up until recently, people have always lived there. So the bath you're talking about, to me, is very unique because there are plenty of examples where, let's say, the Romans took a Greek building and expanded it. But usually it's more like an add-on. It's another building that is becoming a wing.
Like at Paraguay, they really
At
expanded.
Paraguay, you have the gate, and then you build a second gate in front of it. So you have the Greek gate and the Roman gate, and they're connected. That's a hybrid as well. But you can still kind of understand, where one happened versus the other. I think the bathhouse is interesting because the Ottoman bathhouse literally smack inside. The plan, the kind of grid-based plan of the Roman bath is then turning into a round octagonal shape that comes from the Turkish hammam. So that relationship, I think, is very unique because the geometries literally have to work themselves out vis-a-vis each other rather than, in a supplemental way.
Right. And expressively, somebody engaging that bath, the Ottoman individual, they're coming in and out of this larger structure that's above them, but they go into this other structure. I think probably the notion of the space was also probably very, kind of this different scales that experience was at. It was very, very interesting to me. The fact that it was all stone was also super interesting. To kind of complete our talk and thinking about the area, we were also part of, when we go to the Pamphylian coast, we go to Antalya, we go to all these places, we're part of an existing tourism economy. And our, as the JD Foundation, as Upenn, were hosted by the Barut hotel group, Barut Hemera, Cengiz Barut, Mina Barut. There's a living aspect that's going on there, which is called tourism, hotels, etc., emphasizing sea, sand, and sun. But there's also this element, because we see it when we visit all these places, a significant amount of people walking in and around these things. Could you talk a little bit about what you think the role of contemporary architecture could be, both in terms of as a kind of connecting point perhaps between archaeology and the tourism economy, because that's one of the things that's creating kind of sustainability there. And what would you think was needed or is needed? The concept of this studio obviously will be producing some ideas, but in general, in that area, in terms of kind of a contemporary architectural approach.
That's I think, really critical question in general, and I think it's a question one can expand to many sites that are interested or are located at archaeological sites or venues. How do you deal with this if there's a tourism component? Now, Side, as we mentioned before, I think is, to me, probably, if we don't count Antalya, the most obvious place where you have a productive tension between the tourism industry and the archaeological site. Antalya is a big city, so there are many big cities where you look Rome, right? You have many, many cities. Istanbul would be another example where you have archaeological sites within the city and then the city functions. But Side is different because I think the vast majority of Side, the way I see it, is catering toward tourism. And then you have the archaeological component. So how, as an architect, as a designer, can you bring that more to the fore? I think is a very important question. I don't really have an answer other than to say work very carefully within the conditions. So what we see right now, and Ferda has talked about this quite a bit, and I think it's a great first step, is to make deals with the landowners so that when they build, there's a certain percentage they can build on. So you make sure that they still own their land and they can actually benefit from that, which you want, obviously. But you also make sure there is the element of the archaeological site which is not going to be entirely covered or destroyed. So we have seen a whole bunch of examples where buildings are slightly elevated, sitting on concrete pilotis, and then underneath we can see the excavation. So that's one way of going about it. But I think when it comes to the cultural sites, the integration between ancient architecture, archaeological architecture, and the new can literally give shape to new architectural types. So that's my interest. What can these new architectural hybrid types do? What can they look like? How can they equally engage tourists?
Yes.
Both in terms of, the bath is a great example, right? Like everybody likes to go to the bath. We call it spa these days. Nothing has changed. People 2,000 years ago wanted to do the same thing. It's nice to be inside a bath and have hot air and water and steam and all those kinds of things. Now, how can we continue that program, but also really amplify and emphasize how tradition and history has slowly articulated changes to that program? Formal, ornamental, program, technological, all of those. So I think as an architect, you just have to focus and pick examples, and then hopefully you can develop that. I want to say something. We stayed at the Ferda Hotel, as you pointed out. It was really a very wonderful experience, and really gracious of our host.
And they also emphasize sustainability.
I just wanted to get to that. What really struck me, and I was just reading, Cengiz Barut gave me this book about a cuisine, like Turkish cuisine, based on using every part of vegetable or animal, like really not to waste any food, right? And this is something that's happening globally. It was interesting to me to also see that in Side. So the idea of looking at what is in front of you, the whole existing thing. Let's say if it's a broccoli, you don't cut the root off and put it away and just, cook the flour. You find a different way of grinding the root into smaller pieces, and you turn that into some other dish. It's not really that different from what we're talking about in architectural terms, right? You don't separate buildings or building parts and then you choose one over the other because that arc is just a little more visible than a bunch of stones in the corner. You try to find a meaningful reference to all these architectural elements. So that's perhaps another way of making some kind of, finding a relationship between
it's also a creative
environmental
method,
sustainability, culinary culture, architectural culture, etc.
And Side, I think, is really interesting in the sense that we also have previous attempts at bringing together architecture and archaeology. Side Museum, which was founded by the Devres family, Ragip and Salah Devres, late 1950s. It's also in a hammam, and was also had some kind of interesting modernist architectural strategies, and you can see what they tried to do. So Side, I think, is a kind of good laboratory for all that. Food, previous attempts at archaeology, architecture, even philanthropy. Cengiz Barut is investing into it. We have this Devres family, Rukiye Devres. They continue to invest in the place. So I think that the Side seems to be a good laboratory in which to pursue this work. As a last comment, what do you hope to see, the practice of putting together a studio, you never really know what you're going to get at the end, but what do you hope to see at the end of the process in May when we have the jury in Philadelphia, and what do you anticipate seeing, or what do you hope to see?
Of course, I hope to see some kind of manifestation of the ideas and theories that we're talking about. Basically, new techniques of hybridization that find ways of articulating the new and the old in some new performative as well as aesthetic condition. That's number one. More specifically, I'm really curious to understand how the existing building site, the scale of the building, it's a partial ruin. How the students are going to deal with that condition. I'm interested to see models that are taken out of the context that demonstrate the transitioning from, again, the ancient to the new, vis-a-vis a keen understanding of construction techniques, but by using new technologies that express the material in the contemporary ways, but tied to that same idea in terms of a traditional approach to material, but a really, hopefully, avant-garde or pushing the envelope approach to design expression.
And we as a GAD Foundation, we hope to take perhaps some of this work and present it in Side with Ferda Kolatan. So we hope to take the work at the end of the studio and exhibit it in Side. We're both the design work and also the JD Foundation, producing videography, some video documents. Sedin Chamur, Elis Abdik, we have recorded the whole process, and we hope to have some of that on site in this exhibition, and to kind of participate in this conversation in Side, both about tourism, archaeology, architecture, as an important bring together multidisciplines in this very important site. So I want to thank Ferda Kolatan. He is Associate Professor of Architecture at the Architecture Department of the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. And we have been speaking about the studio, third-year MArch studio at Weitzman, Advanced Design Research?
Yes.
Advanced Design Research Studio, which we just came back from a trip down to see in Antalya. Thanks a lot, Ferda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, GAD Foundation.
Hi, I'm Gökhan Karakuş for the GAD Foundation. We are here at the GAD offices in Istanbul, Turkey, and we're talking to George Koso. George is the teaching assistant to Ferda Kolatan's Masters of Architecture studio program in University of Pennsylvania, and recently we just came back from the Turkish Mediterranean, and I wanted to speak a little bit about that experience there. So George, you had actually been in Turkey before because you're a graduate of the Weitzman School at the University of Pennsylvania, correct?
Correct, yeah. So I graduated from Weitzman in School of Architecture in 2023, and I was part of Ferda Studio and the Cappadocia Studio. So we came to Cappadocia, and we were actually here in the foundation as well when I was a student. So our trip was to Istanbul and to Cappadocia, so it was really cool to now understand more the Pamphylia part of Turkey and to understand the coast and what are the archaeological sites that are there. It's a completely different experience than what Cappadocia is, and to see all the ruins that we saw, I mean, all of that was extremely cool. And now to be part of, part with Ferda and teaching the studio and doing a completely different project that Ferda hasn't done in a long time it's a really cool experience.
So as you graduated from the Weitzman School Master's Program in Architecture, can you describe a little bit about that program, what you learned as a student, and what today, as you look back 2 years since you graduated, what about that education you think was very valuable in your understanding of architecture?
So again, the school itself has a lot to offer. It's a design school at the end of the day. It's not really a technical school. And what I appreciate about the school is the fact of that you get to create very experimental work. And in the 2 years that I was there, I was able to open my mind into things that I never thought I would be doing in an architecture school, and learning a bunch of new programs and programs that actually, as an architect, you can deviate to other professions. It doesn't have to be that it's an architecture that you're just an architect. You can deviate to other professions with the knowledge that you learn on Penn and all the resources the school has.
Right.
So for me, it was a phenomenal experience in that, and obviously having a professor like Ferda, it was amazing. In that studio, I learned so much. I learned how to think conceptually about my project, and just to think more thoroughly and more detail about what a project is. And that's why, as a professor, I think Ferda is amazing, and he's kind of the backbone of what Upenn represents.
Right.
So for me, that was the experience.
Now you transitioned after you graduated, into a role as a teaching assistant. This is, I believe, your second teaching assistant position, or third?
No, I've been teaching assistant, so I've been summer 2023, fall 2023, then spring, fall.
So you've been doing this
fall,
for quite a
almost
while.
2 years now, about in the summer.
What does a teaching assistant do, and then what do you specifically, in terms of your role as a teaching assistant in these master level programs at the Weitzman School, do?
Okay, so I guess I take it more that as a personal question. In a sense, for me, a teaching assistant should be the mediator between what the lead professor and the students, the intermediate communication. So and again, teaching with other professors, which I have in Penn, differs. Each professor has their own way of introducing the teaching assistant. I like to be part of the design process. I like to be part of the translation of the ideas of what the professor wants and the students want, and try to be the mediator between those two, and also help with software, helping representation, helping ways that the projects will look better. And also, my job is not to tell them what to design. I don't like to sit with the student and tell them like you should do this like that. I like to pick their brain out. I like to ask them questions, which is the most important thing. I feel like teaching is not just about telling somebody what to do, but understanding what the students want to do, so then you can guide them through the process. And I think as a teaching assistant, that's what I value as my job, and also all the stuff that I've learned from other professors in the past,
Right.
including Ferda, and putting that into account into my own way to portray ideas to the students.
Okay, so you had this challenging role now as a teaching assistant, and you have to travel to this location in southern Turkey. You just got back yesterday,
Yeah.
the Mediterranean region. And you used a good word there, Pamphylia. What are your impressions of Antalya, the ancient Pamphylia region of Anatolia?
I mean, honestly, it was impressive. I mean, just going in Temessos, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly,
Yeah,
but Temessos, I mean, going up that hike and being able to see that amphitheater was, I mean, it hasn't been touched. It's just the way it is. To me, that was impressive, like super impressive.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't believe my eyes on what I was looking at. And also yesterday, the sites that we saw what was the name of the site that we saw? The one that
Sidio.
CDO. So that was extremely impressive to see how the amphitheater at the top of the mountain, how all the rocks have fallen down.
Right.
And then you have that beautiful view of skyline of the city, and to understand that that was a strategy for the people there to defend themselves.
Right.
To go through all those walls, to be able to attack the Byzantine temple at the top. So, I mean, to me, that was all interesting.
What do you think is the role of archaeology and interacting with these archaeological excavations in the education of an architect? Like, what do you think, did you learn, because you also were in some excavations in Cappadocia.
Yeah.
What do you feel is a role today of archaeology or archaeological understanding in architecture? It's not as popular as it used to be, because we know that the last 30, 40 years archaeology has shifted out of architectural thinking. What do you see today as a role of archaeology in the education of an architect?
Honestly, I think like I mean, archaeology is so downplayed, and I mean, when we were in CIDE, in the museum, and we went through all these labs, and we saw how these people do archaeology, how they clean, how they photograph them, the care and process that takes to do these things. As an architect, it gets you to understand that like, when you find these things and you do them, it's like you treat them as these precious things. And also for an architect, that's if you're making a physical model. It's like, how do you treat that? How do you make that happen? How do you clean it? How do you take the photographs? So for me, as an architect, you have to be aware of archaeology. You have to be aware, because at the end of the day, archaeology stuff found is also architecture. So,
Right.
you know, and I think as a student, I'm still a student as for what I am, graduated, but still learning new stuff, you know. I think that we need to understand archaeology. We need to understand the sites. We need to understand what these people go through to be able, for us architects, appreciate what is found. Because we're not the ones finding them, they are finding them, and then we go and we study them, and we compare them, and we study the stones, we study what they made them with, how they made them, the materials they brought into the site to do it. So I think that's all important for us.
What do you, so to follow up on that question,
Yeah.
what do you, now that you're in the teaching assistant role, you observe the students interacting with the archaeology, what do you think they got out of this trip in terms of what they saw and what they experienced in all these? We went to Antalya, we went to CIDE, Aspendos, Parge, Sidion, Termissos. What do you think they got out of all these sites?
Honestly, they got a sense of scale. That's a huge thing. They got a sense of scale. They had a visceral touch on what these materials are, and also they understood how these materials are being put together, and also what type of stones are being used. For example, the project site in CIDE, they understood that they had different ways of putting the stones together. They were crumbling them with seashells, like we saw in the other bath. And I feel like the students now have a completely different understanding what this ruins are,
Right.
how big they are, how big the stones are. So for me, it was a sense of scale because they were all like,
Right.
whoa, I need to look at this again.
Right.
When I go back to Philadelphia, I gotta like rethink some of the stuff that I thought I had figured out, but now I have to understand how the stones come together. And if I'm trying to do a strategy like that, how am I gonna be able to do this?
And that's part of the goal of the traveling studio is to
Correct.
have this level of interaction with both culture, material, context. Correct?
Yes.
Have you been to other places? Like you were in Peru, I believe.
Yeah, so I have been, so in terms of traveling studios, I have gone to Italy, I went to Peru, went to Machu Picchu, and was able to see the ruins in Machu Picchu, which it was amazing. I mean, the stone architecture in Peru is, the Incas were immense. I mean, it's like something that every architecture student or any architect should go and appreciate and see. And thanks to archaeology, we're able to appreciate those things, right? So I also went to Argentina, and Argentina was not more of an archaeological site in Buenos Aires. It's more about the contemporary and how the city grid, because it has the biggest city grid in the world, and it's. I mean, you in some parts you feel like you're in French architecture. Some of them you feel like Mediterranean. Some of them you feel like you're in Soviet Union. So it's like there's so many different aspects in the city, and it's so dense and it's so rich in the culture and the brutalist architecture in Argentina that is extremely popular over there, and all the buildings that were done back in the 1960s, 1970s. So I think I've learned a lot in being in these traveling studios, and this one specifically just for the appreciation that I have for Ferda as a professor, and
Right,
what I've
right,
learned from him as a mentor, you know, working alongside of him as a research assistant, and also now working with him now on this. So I think like that all has given me a lot of experience in how to be the best teaching assistant possible for the students and my experience to share with them.
Okay, let's sort of complete our discussion with the discussion of the project itself. So we're in Side,
Yeah.
which is to the east of Antalya, on the coastline. It's this kind of peninsula that juts out, and it's part of the Pamphylian region, port city, and we're working on the Grand Hammam there. Can you sort of can you describe your what you saw in Side? What is in terms of both excavations, but also the kind of tourism economy and culture, and then lastly, in terms of the project, what is the Ferda Kolatan studio trying to do in terms of the Grand Hammam as a project?
Okay. So what I saw in terms of tourism, I mean, it was pretty empty, I guess, for that time when we went, and I think that was nice because we're able to actually appreciate everything in Side. In terms of the tourism, there's a lot of new buildings, and I guess everything, all the new shops and all the stuff that we saw. Talking to Ferda, and I learned that like all these things were just built at the same time. I mean, none of them are old; they're all pretty new stuff. So like I feel like the ruins plus the touristy side. I mean, there's kind of like a balance where you go in and you have all the shops and you have all these restaurants, but then you have the ruins, you have the Grand Hammam, and I think that in terms of what Sida has to offer, it starts to show you a difference between the history and show you the difference in between the new development that has been done. So in the grand scheme of what the studio is trying to do, we're trying to do a bathhouse that is not just a bathhouse, right? We're trying to think about contemporary ideas. We're trying to hybridize the hybrid in between the ruins and new architecture, new moves, new ways of thinking, so that the ideas that the students don't fall in the category where like they're just like, oh, I'm gonna put 3 rectangle pools here, I'm gonna close it up and call it a day, right? We want the students to understand that they can go beyond a new idea.
Right.
So understanding what's there, and for them being there, now they are more intellectual in terms of like, oh, like all these moves that I was making back 2-3 weeks ago through studio time and talking to Ferda, now we're gonna be smarter and we're gonna make moves that make sense to the scale of
Right,
the Grand
right.
Hammam. Because that's the biggest thing, the scale, that's where they were all extremely confused. And then the new scale is gonna give them a sense of how they want to design, and also all the process they have had, because they have had a lot of process in the last couple of weeks coming into here. They're going to be able to look back and see, okay, so I did this, this doesn't make sense, this makes sense, and then try to take that into the next step in the studio, and that goes into making physical models.
Right, got it.
You know, this is a whole building scale, so we're going to have drawings, we're going to have renderings, and a physical model towards the end of the semester. So,
I think in terms of the GAD Foundation and the support by the Budded Hotels, which is one of the major hotels in Cide, our objectives are that working with Ferda and George, they would create new contemporary architectural propositions for this area archaeologically, architecturally. Our goal is to bring together these two disciplines of archaeology and architecture, especially contemporary architecture. And we look forward to the outcome of the studio in May. So I have been with George Caruso. He is a teaching assistant at the University of Pennsylvania, Weitzman School, and he was with us, and he is supporting Ferda Kolatan's studio at the Weitzman School that took place in Cide, Antalya. Thanks, George.
thank you, Gogan. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.